All right, friends. Hey, so I'm Luke. This is really sad. It's been almost 6 full months. Next week would have been 6 months to the day since I was here last. That's got to change. But it's great to be back here. My wife and I, we bring you warm greetings from South Bend. Been a very long time since we've been able to bring warm greetings from South Bend to anywhere, but we're very happy that we get to bring them to you. We bring these greetings to you in the name of Jesus Christ. We bring also excitement both about the church plant. We hope to get some time after the service to talk to you about how things are going there. We also hope for in the future that we get opportunities to share with you in some kind of grace group maybe what's going on at the church plant, how we're approaching that work, and maybe find ways for you guys to be involved and to plug in. Be pretty exciting. And we also bring our son Jack, the newest addition to our family. So if you haven't met Jack, he's, yes, hey, I'm not a big fan of clapping, but for Jack, we'll allow it. So Jack's certainly a delight to our hearts. We hope you get to meet him and that he brings delight to you as well. So friends, if you got a Bible or a cell phone or an iPad, no judgment here. If you got a Bible in some form, pull it out and turn to Mark chapter 10. We're going to be taking a look at a nice long chunk. We're going to start in verse 35 of Mark 10, and we're going to read to the end of the chapter. And we're going to join Jesus on the road to Jerusalem. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem where he's going to be crucified. So he's heading to his death. He's heading to kind of the climactic events of his life. And that's where we're going to join him. Mark 10, we're going to start in verse 35. We'll read this scripture, and then I'll pray for us, and we'll jump right in. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant that we may sit, one on your right hand, one on your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized?" They said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized, but to sit on my right hand or on my left, this isn't mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them, but it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Then they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. When he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him here." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, stand up. He's calling for you." Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up, came to Jesus, and answering him, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and began following him, on the road. Brothers and sisters, this is the word of the Lord. Let's bow and pray. Well, our God and Father, you are the Lord of the word. And we submit ourselves to it this morning. We need you to send your Spirit to us because this word is alive. It is active. It is powerful. It's piercing. And so we need your Spirit to be present, not just to open our minds so that we understand it, but we need fresh courage to take. Because this text demands that we change. Your word always demands that we change. But your word also always points us to Jesus. So we ask not just for courage and not just for understanding. We ask that you'd open our eyes and that you'd ready our mouths so that we would taste and see your goodness as we find Jesus in this text, a Lord who is powerful, who is mighty to save. So we ask for these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. Well, this text, believe it or not, it's about power. And it's worth for just a second maybe pointing out that all of us in this room, we all have power. And for roughly middle class Western Americans, we normally that's not the normal category with which we function. We don't normally think of ourselves as being people who have a lot of power. In fact, a lot of times we probably think the exact opposite. We feel very powerless. Maybe economic circumstances have you feeling powerless, or maybe a boss, or maybe your physical health makes you feel powerless. We don't tend to think of ourselves as having power, but we do. We have money, maybe not a lot, but we have money, we have relationships, we have jobs, we have communities. All of these provide a context in which we can do things, a context in which we can make things, and that's what power is. And Jesus in these two passages, I think Jesus is trying to show us first how power becomes corrupted. That's what we see in the first little vignette where James and John come to Jesus. The ways that power can be corrupted. And then in the second vignette where Jesus heals Bartimaeus, we see how power can be redeemed. And that's all we want to do. We want to look at how power corrupts and then how power can be redeemed. All right? So let's jump in. All right, the first place that we have to stop is before we reach the end of the very first sentence. So you can see this in chapter 10, verse 35. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus. And the reason we got to stop is because this is completely unique in the Gospels. Totally unique. Now you should say, now wait a second. What's unique about this? These guys are disciples. What do disciples do? All they do over and over and over again. They come up to Jesus and they ask questions. They never seem to understand anything. They're always coming up to Jesus. They're always asking questions, always trying to get him to explain something to me. What's unique about this? Well, what's unique about this is that it's only James and John who come up to Jesus. So in Mark chapter 5, for example, it's James and John come to Jesus, but it's James and John and Peter. And then in chapter 9, Peter and James and John. And then in chapter 10, Peter and James and John. And chapter 14, Peter and James and John. And even in chapter 13, Peter and James and John show up with Andrew. So who's missing from this equation? It's Peter. This is the only time that James and John come up to Jesus without Peter. And this is very strange. Why? Well, some of you who've read the Gospels a lot, you know that Peter and James and John, they had a special relationship to Jesus. They actually have become to be called the inner circle, Jesus' inner circle. Jesus had a lot of disciples, but he had 12 that he was really pouring his life into. And from those 12, there were 3 that he was really, really close to, Peter, James, and John. But a couple of chapters earlier, and just earlier in chapter 10, Peter had been criticized by Jesus. Peter he'd said some things that they seemed to make Jesus kind of upset. And Jesus responded. Jesus called him out, called him down. And James and John took this as an opportunity to pounce. Maybe now they can get a little closer to Jesus even than Peter. Maybe James and John can start to capitalize on this relationship that they have with Jesus and put some distance between Jesus and Peter. And this is the first way that power can corrupt. Power corrupts or one of the ways that power can be corrupted is by giving us an inordinate desire or focus on status. And the way that it happened with James and John right here is often how it happens with us. How did it happen? Well, they saw a group that they wanted to be in, a tight-knit group with Jesus, which is pretty good, but they also wanted to exclude other people from it. They wanted to exclude Peter. This is one of the major ways that power becomes corrupted. C.S. Lewis is a great hero of mine. He was a British professor. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, which have been turned into movies. He's a great author, but he wrote a lot of nonfiction essays. He was a Christian. He converted to Christianity pretty late in life, in his 30s. He was already a professor, and so he was a pretty hardened critic of Christianity, had a pretty impressive conversion experience, a pretty dramatic conversion experience that completely altered his life, and shortly thereafter he started teasing out the implications of what it was to be a Christian. One of the essays that he wrote after this point was called The Inner Ring. And Lewis says, you know what an inner ring is? An inner ring is that group that you want to be a part of. And you know what this is like. You know how cliques work. You know how these little circles work. They only work if there are people on the outside. You want to be on the inside. That makes you feel good. But the only reason it makes you feel good is because there are people who aren't in there. If everybody was in this, it wouldn't make you feel nearly as good. Lewis says that throughout our lives, we bounce from inner ring to inner ring. Whenever we're always looking for a new inner ring, a new way to feel like we've got a certain kind of status, a certain kind of prominence, a certain kind of value. So let me flesh this out in a kind of a subtle way for how it actually plays out in my life. And as I do this, I hope you'll start to hear that you can almost hear the subtle whisper of the serpent. Remember the serpent in Genesis 3? You remember he told 2 lies to Adam and Eve, and we're going to see them both this morning. But one of them, he said, you'll be like God. And you can hear this whisper going to James and John. You'll be like God, not like these other guys. You're not going to be like these other guys. You could be like God. There's the rest of the disciples. They're part of the herd. You ride above the herd. You can excuse yourself from their company because you're better than them, and you can excuse them from your company because they're beneath you. That's the lie of the serpent. You hear it here. I hear it in my own life, and here's one place where. So we've mentioned, I hope that you guys have been hearing a little bit from Terry, that we're planting a church. And one of the things that I do a few days a week, my wife and I are moving into the neighborhood where we're planting. We're relocating there. And so I spend a few days a week just meeting people in the neighborhood. I'm trying to meet as many people as I can, do some networking, but also to just establish some relationships and learn how this neighborhood works. Learn its rhythms, learn its times. And I'm a bivocational pastor. It just means I've got 2 jobs. One of them, as Carl mentioned, I'm a professor at, honestly, it's a university that a lot of people would recognize, but I'm also a pastor. I'm a full-time pastor. I teach part-time at a university. Now, you guys tell me, which of these do you think sounds more impressive to the average person on the street? Now, I teach philosophy, so even being a professor is pretty weird. But one of these is a little less weird than the other, being a professor, right? So when I'm introducing myself to someone new, I have 2 options. I can introduce myself as someone who is a pastor who's planting a church, or I can introduce myself as someone who teaches at Notre Dame and who also happens to be planting a church in the area. Which do you think I do? I lead off with Notre Dame. Why? Well, part of that is because I'm a coward. You know, people hear you're a pastor and they start to look at you funny, and nobody likes that, and I'm as afraid of that as the next guy. That's part of the reason, but there's another reason, and it's more related to what we see James and John doing. You see, when I'm meeting somebody new, I start to feel like I've got to put some distance between the rest of the pastors that I know. I mean, there are tons of pastors in the city. There are a dime a dozen, in fact. But pastors who are also professors? That's a kind of a big deal. I can start to buy into my own press. And these new people that I'm trying to meet, they are my little inner ring. And I'm trying to get into that little inner ring. And all that it costs me is I have to sell out my brother pastors, and I have to sell out the gospel of grace. That's all it costs. And sadly, I do it. I hear the whisper, and a lot of times I just can't tune it out. I hear Satan's whisper telling me that you can be more than you are. You can be like God, not like these other pastors. That's one of the ways that power corrupts, by giving us an inordinate, consuming desire for a certain kind of status that excludes other people. All right, now that's the first way that power corrupts. And it's been almost 10 minutes, and we're not even through the first sentence. So we got almost 20 verses. We're going to be here for not nearly that long. We'll go a little quicker through the second point. What's the other thing that this passage teaches us about how power corrupts us? Well, we see it in James and John's request in verse 37. James and John, they say to Jesus, "Let us sit, one on your left, one on your right, in your glory." They want to sit with Jesus in his glory. Now, where did this idea come from? If you grew up in the church, of course, that's what we think Jesus does all the time. He just sits around in glory. But that's not what a first century person would have thought. So, where did this come from? Where did this idea that Jesus would be sitting in glory come from? It actually comes from right before the passage that we started to read. We started to read in verse 35. But if you read chapter 10, verses 32, 33, and 34, you'd see where it came up. Jesus refers to himself in verses 33 and 34, he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And again, you grow up, if you happen to grow up in the church, you hear Son of Man, and we just equate that with Jesus. But in the first century, for someone who grew up only with the Old Testament, they hear the Son of Man, and they immediately think of the one place in the Old Testament where that name shows up, in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, we are told a little bit about the Son of Man, and you can see it here. The Son of Man is given dominion, glory, and a kingdom forever, and all the peoples, nations, and men of every language serve him. So when these disciples, when they heard Jesus say, "I'm the Son of Man," they immediately say, "Oh, I know what the Son of Man is like. He has glory and dominion. He has a kingdom forever." And everyone comes and serves him. Now this is striking and new. This is the first time Jesus has called himself the Son of Man, and you can see why it might have gripped James and John. You can see why it might have been something that really sticks out to them. But the reason why it's so surprising is it seems like James and John ignored the rest of what Jesus said. Jesus didn't say, "I'm the Son of Man, and I have been given glory and dominion and a kingdom forever, and all the nations, men of every language, will come and serve me." He says instead that I'm the Son of Man, and I'm going to be given to the chief priests, to the scribes. They're going to kill me, and then hand me over to our sworn enemies, the Gentiles. So they heard what they wanted, and then they ignored the less than subtle warning that Jesus had given. You guys know what this is like, this selective hearing. You hear what you want to hear. You turn the volume way down on what you don't want to hear. This is exactly what happens with James and John. And here's where we hear, if you listen very carefully, you can hear the serpent whispering that second lie. You shall not die. Jesus is talking about being handed over, being killed, being tortured, being given to his enemies. You shall not die. You shall rule. If he's the Son of Man, you'll be with him, and you could have dominion and glory and a kingdom forever, and all the nations could come and serve you. This is what James and John want, not just status, they want to be served. And of course, this temptation, this way that power corrupts, it corrupts our authority. That's how Jesus refers to it here. This is a corruption of our authority, our desire to be served by other people. And we all know what this is like too. Now, I'm a relative, I keep hitting this, I'm sorry. I'm a relatively new husband. And I was single for a pretty long time relative to a lot of my other friends. And so most of my friends, for the longest time, for 10 or 15 years, they were all married. And when I would talk to husbands, they'd tell me about this phenomenon. Those of you who are married or who have been married, maybe you can relate to this. They tell me about this phenomenon where you come home from a long day's work, and you just want your home to be the one place where what you want happens. You want the meal to be ready. You want the kids to be well behaved. You want the kids to be ready to go down. You come back to your house after a long day's work, and you want to be served. And I kind of understood what they were talking about. Now that I've been married for a few years, now I understand that as well. I understand what it's like to come home and to expect to be served, and then to feel frustration when what I want or what I expect isn't met. And you don't have to be married for this to happen. Maybe, you come home and you want your kids to serve you. Or you come home and you want your spouse to serve you. But maybe you go off to work and you start feeling frustration with your coworkers or your colleagues or your employees because you want them to be meeting your needs. You want them even maybe to know what your needs are before you have them. You want them that quickly and that quickly met. That's one way that you see this. But you also might have a boss, and you start feeling certain kinds of frustration towards your boss because he's not meeting your needs. He's not doing what you want. He's not doing what you expect. Now, I'm not going to go into detail. It's a little too embarrassing a story, actually. But some years ago, Jenny and I, we had made some plans for Valentine's Day, and it was one of these spectacularly failed Valentine's Day. Now, I kind of hate Valentine's Day anyway. I'm not a big fan of the holiday, but maybe you guys know what it's like to have really big expectations for a holiday and then to have them utterly and completely dashed. Well, Jenny and I had one of those kinds of experiences, and this was exactly what was going on. Each of us had desires for what was going to happen. We wanted those desires to be met. We wanted to be served by the other person, but there were conflicting expectations. Neither of us met those expectations, and so it ruined the whole day. This was what was going on. It was an abuse, a corruption of authority. And into this, or out of this corruption of power, Jesus is calling us. And we see it in his response to the disciples. He says this, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them." They're recognized as rulers. They want status. They want to be recognized as rulers, so they lord it over them. And there are these great men who love to exercise their authority. They love to have power. They want to be served. But Jesus won't let them settle for that. He wants to call it, he gives them a diagnosis. You're misusing your power, you're misunderstanding your power, because even the Son of Man, who is given dominion and glory and a kingdom forever, he was sent not to be served, but to serve and to give his life. That's the diagnosis. Now, let's look at the second vignette. The healing of Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. Let's look at the healing of Bartimaeus, and we'll see not just that Jesus gives us a good diagnosis and that he's calling us out, but as we look at this passage, we'll see 4 things that Jesus does that can redeem power and that can actually redeem us from power's corruption. Okay? 4 things. So we're going to move really quickly. The first thing that we see, you can see in verses 46 and 49. Jesus, he's on his way from Jericho. He's on his way to Jerusalem. And remember, this wasn't just the most important week of Jesus' life. This is the most important week in human history. Jesus is on his way, and the text says Jesus stopped. He stopped. Now, the Greek is actually really stark. This probably doesn't quite get at it. It's more like Jesus stood still. So Jesus is walking, he's probably teaching. All of a sudden he hears Bartimaeus, and he just stands still. And friends, what an important discipline this is. We have power. Our power enables us to do certain things. Our power enables us to set plans, to have agendas, to get projects up and running. And if you're anything like me, once you're on your way doing something, you don't want to be delayed. You don't want to be redirected. You don't want to have any kind of interruption to what you're doing. But Jesus stands still. Jesus stops. Jesus' power, it allows interruptions. And that's the first thing that we've got to come to grips with. This is maybe the hardest part of the sermon for me. Jesus' power allows for interruptions. I hate being interrupted. And I actually struggle with overwork. Lots of pastors do. I'm no exception. I have lots of programs and projects that I have to be off and running doing. When Jenny and I first got married and we were talking about the church plant, she called me, she brought me up short on something because I didn't realize there was a huge blind spot in my life, and I didn't realize that I never allowed for interruptions. She said, "Luke, you're always going off to lead some Bible study or to do some kind of small group. You've got so many programs going that whenever you're home, you're kind of home, but not really. No one can come by, no one can stop. No one you say goodbye to them on your way out the door, but no one comes by. And if you're going to plant a church, if you're going to be a good neighbor in our neighborhood, you got to be around. People have got to be able to interrupt you. They've got to be able to stop by. They've got to be able to, we've got to be able to invite them to dinner. And right now, we can't do that. We'll never be able to plant a church if this doesn't change. And Jen, as is normally the case, she was exactly right. And Jesus here shows us you have to allow for interruptions. Interesting exercise for you guys to do on your own. Read through the Gospels sometime and take a look at all of Jesus' miracles and notice how many of those miracles happen as an interruption. Jesus is on his way to some other place, and he allows himself to be diverted, and he heals someone else. Most of them. An overwhelming majority of the miracles, of the healings, of the ministry of Jesus happens as some kind of interruption. This shows us that our power, this starts to unfold. Our power is not about us. Our power is not about our plans. Our power is about other people. We are given power to steward for the good of others. So Jesus' power allows for interruptions. The second thing that we see is when we pause to take a look at who is on the receiving end of this miracle. This, interestingly, is Jesus' last healing miracle before he goes to the cross. It's kind of a big deal. So who is the last person that he heals? It's a blind beggar. And this shows us the second thing that Jesus' power does that can redeem our corrupted power, the corruption of power that we experience. Jesus' power, it crosses cultural boundaries and goes to the margins. The blind, the poor, these then and now, they're at a different culture. They're at a different socioeconomic culture. Most of us in the room are probably somewhere in the middle class. This is a very different economic class. It's different for us now. It was definitely different for them. So let's think about who would be in the margins of society, in the margins of our culture. Who are those that are marginalized? Well, we could actually just look at the margins of life. We could look at the beginning of life, the unborn. Very marginalized in our culture. We could look at the other margin to life, the end of life. We could look at the elderly or the infirmed. Very marginalized. You can think of foster kids. Kids that are in the foster care system, often ignored. Often, maybe not as much in Napanee, I don't know, but in South Bend, kids in the public schools, marginalized. Children in general tend to be marginalized. But you can also think of, what about the culture of Napanee in general, or what about the culture of our church? Are there people in our church community that are on the margins? They're kind of on the fringes. Maybe they haven't been brought in to the full communion. Maybe they're not vibrant members. Or if you happen to be in school, you could think of your school and say, where are the margins here, and who could I reach out to? Jesus' power always goes to the margins. So friends, if you want to make this really practical, let me give you some practical, I try not to do this. I'm a Presbyterian, of course, so I try not to be practical if I can avoid it, but we'll make an exception this morning. Here's what I'd encourage you to do. Sit down. Don't do this alone. If you got a family, sit down with your family. If you got a group of friends, sit down with them. If you're in a grace group, maybe you sit down with your grace group. If you're in some other kind of Bible study, sit down with them and start to say, who do you guys think that who do you guys think that we, our family, who do you guys think that we would be really well equipped to serve? Where are the margins that we feel really passionate about? Or that maybe we're uniquely equipped to reach? And so maybe you think, I care a lot about the incarcerated. Jesus is very clear that we can't forget about those who are in jails. We need to be visiting them. Maybe you think, I really care about them. And given my past, given my history, I could be really effective there. That's where I want to use my power to go to the margins. Not flashy, not exciting. It's not going to draw a lot of attention, but we go to the margins. Or maybe you say, I really care about the unborn. I care about women who are thinking about abortion because they're in financial pressures or they've had a really bad relationship. I care about these women. I care about their children. Or maybe you care about the men involved. And you find a way to get involved there. You look for the margins, and we go. Because Jesus didn't just allow himself to be interrupted. He actively pursued those on the margins. Bartimaeus was a blind beggar, but it wasn't like this was a really surprising thing for Jesus to do, because he always crossed cultural boundaries. He always sought out the marginalized. Now, so first, Jesus' power allows for interruptions. Second, Jesus' power pursues those at the margins. It reaches the margins. And, again, this is the third time that I'm mentioning this, that probably most of us are middle class. And so it's possible, I'd be a little surprised, but it's possible that you feel a little guilty. You know, let's talk about how we should be engaging the marginalized, and you think, man, maybe I should be doing more. I bet that probably most of us don't feel guilty. But you might actually start to feel pretty good. I mean, after all, God has given us, relatively speaking, we're pretty wealthy compared to the rest of the world. We're heading into the summer months, and so maybe you're in a place where you have a little bit more time, or maybe you don't work as much, and so you have a little more free time. You start to think, yeah, I really could go and serve the marginalized. Or maybe you think, I already do serve the marginalized, and it starts to make you feel pretty good. And here's where I want to issue a certain kind of caution, because it's very easy, especially for middle-class types, to do what, there's one Presbyterian pastor in Chattanooga, Tennessee, he calls it drive-by mercy. And it's, you can kind of get what it would be. It's, you just lob a little help out every once in a while. You reach in, you serve at a soup kitchen every once in a while. And it makes you feel good, eases your conscience. You don't feel all that guilty. You start to feel worthwhile as a church member or something like that. That kind of help is often even more damaging than doing nothing at all. And Jesus doesn't just stop. Jesus doesn't just reach out to the blind beggar. We see at the end that Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus, and then blind Bartimaeus joins Jesus on the road. Jesus' power doesn't just reach out to the margins. Jesus' power disciples people out of the margins. And brothers and sisters, this requires way more than drive-by mercy, hit and miss, hit and run mercy. This requires relational continuity. The slow, patient, persevering work of starting and cultivating real deep relationships with the people that we're trying to serve. One thing to go to a soup kitchen, another thing to go to a soup kitchen to cultivate a relationship and then bring that person into church life. Jesus wasn't about drive-by mercy. It wasn't about hit and run mercy. Jesus was trying to bring people on the road of discipleship with him. And that's absolutely what we've got to do. That's absolutely what redeemed power does. It doesn't just drive by, it doesn't just hit and run, it disciples people out of it. Randy Neighbors, again, this pastor from Chattanooga, he planted a church, and at the heart of that church is a desire to do mercy ministry. And he says, this is how you get people out of poverty. You don't give them handouts to get them out of poverty. You get them to be disciples of Jesus, and then they're discipled out of their poverty. Whether it's economic or spiritual, this is what we have to do. We have to disciple people out of poverty. And now we can be really brief in this last point. When we look at Bartimaeus' request, we see, especially when we compare it to James and John. James and John make their request, and Jesus' response is the same. He says, what do you want me to do for you? James and John make their request, and Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. You see, Jesus isn't just calling us out of corrupted power. He's doing a lot more. Jesus is doing battle with the serpent's lies. Right here, he's battling the serpent's exact same tactics from Genesis 3. They've echoed down the centuries. Jesus is right here continually doing battle with the accuser, with the liar. He is here confronting these lies. And this is important and crucial, because what Satan wants to do is he wants us to think we use our power to become more than human, to become like God. And the tragic irony is, the more that you use your power to try to become more like God, to become less and less like other people, the more that you try to make yourself more than them, to make yourself superior to them, the more you become less human. The more that we use our power to try to become more than human, tragically we become less than human. But look at Bartimaeus' request. He says, Rabboni, I just want to regain my sight. I just want to be what a normal human is. I just want to be a fully functioning, fully flourishing human. And brothers and sisters, Jesus came to renew and to restore broken humanity. Jesus' power doesn't just allow interruptions, go to the margins, disciple people out of the margins. It restores, it brings restoration. It restores people to full humanity. So let me close with this. It's a quotation from, I'll get to the quotation in just a second. There's a guy named Andy Crouch. How many of you guys have ever heard of the magazine Christianity Today? Maybe about half. It's kind of a popular Christian magazine. He's one of the editors, and he recently wrote a book on this subject. It's just a book about how to redeem power, and it's pretty good. And I'll close in just a second with a thought that he offered us. But before I get there, I want to draw your attention to one last detail, and then we'll close. You might have seen it in verse 47. Bartimaeus, he doesn't just hear that Jesus is coming. He doesn't just hear that Jesus is walking down the road. He hears that Jesus the Nazarene is on his way out. And this is striking, because there's only one other place in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is referred to as Jesus the Nazarene, and it's in Mark chapter 1, verse 24. And that was Jesus' first healing miracle. And Mark chapter 10, these last verses, 52, and so this is his last healing miracle. And so Jesus is bracketed. He's introduced as the Nazarene. He's kind of on his way out, being told that he's the Nazarene. And in the Old Testament, there's only one other place where the Nazarene plays a big role. And you guys might remember this. It's in Judges 16. The Nazarene is the anointed of the Lord who comes to redeem his people in strength. The only place that it ever shows up is in Judges 16, where it's talking about Samson. Now, Samson was an interesting character, and here we see the guy that Samson was pointing to. Samson brings freedom to his people by killing his enemies, but Jesus here brings freedom and release, power and justice, the anointed of the Lord, bringing God's power to bear for his people by dying for his enemies. He doesn't kill them. You see, Jesus doesn't just redeem corrupted power. He redeems us from power's corruption by becoming powerless. He heals a blind Bartimaeus, but Jesus himself was blinded. Do you remember Luke 22? He's blindfolded. He loses his sight, and people start beating him in the face. Jesus redeems us from the corruption of power by becoming powerless. He gives us sight by losing his sight, and we can't stop at looking at Jesus' death for us, because when we, empowered by the Spirit of Christ's resurrection, stand still, when we reach out to the margins, when we disciple people out of the margins, when we try to bring renewal and restoration into the community, bringing people into right relationship with God, right relationship with other peoples, we're actually bringing that future, we're getting a taste of that future restoration, that future renewal that will one day finally and fully come. And we will dwell in a land where there is no more injustice, where there is no more corrupted use of power, where the corruption of power doesn't hurt anyone else. When we follow Jesus, empowered by His Spirit, we're bringing that to bear. And that's why Andy Crouch closes his book with these words. And we'll close with this as we come to the table. Like Jesus, brothers and sisters, we are meant to pour out our power fearlessly, to spend our privilege recklessly, and to leave our status in the dust of our headlong pursuit of love. We are meant to do all this like Him, because far more than we ever dreamed or feared, we are made like Him, and like Him we will rise. Brothers and sisters, this is the promise of the gospel. This is the power of the gospel. We will one day rise with Christ. Let's pray. Well, Father, we thank you so much for this. We thank you for these disciples. We learned so much from them. And honestly, we're a lot like them. So I don't want us to leave this time of Bible study, of hearing the word preached, without concrete ways that we need to change. So send your Spirit to convict us. Send your Spirit to actually inspire us to real, serious change. We want this for Jesus' sake and not just our own. But we also want it for the sake of our community. We want it for the sake of our world. We want it for the sake of the marginalized. We want these people to be brought in, and we want to experience right relationship with you, discipleship with Jesus. So again, give us the courage, the strength, indeed, yes, the power that we need. The power that we need to reach people on the margins, the power that we need to go to the margins to disciple them out. Make us more and more apprentices and disciples of Jesus, we ask in his name, we ask for his sake, we ask it through his Spirit.